everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this special panel celebrating 20 years of publication of Corpus. And this panel, my name is Carlos Decena. I am director of the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice, New Brunswick, which is part of this larger institute funded by the Mellon Foundation, which seeks to bring together the university community and the communities that are connected to Rutgers in thinking through questions around social and racial justice. This event itself is part of a special series that was developed during this calendar year. The series emerged partly in conversation or as a result of conversations that I've held with my longtime friend, Pato Hebert, who will be speaking to us shortly, related to the connections and the continuities between the COVID crisis, which we continue to experience, and the history of the longstanding history of AIDS activism and AIDS hell-raising that has shaped so much of our own process of becoming professionals, in our case, as longstanding researchers, activists, and artists, creatives engaged in AIDS work. Pato and I, Pato will speak for himself, but what prompted some of the initial thinking was how much of what we were seeing, what we were witnessing in the context of COVID, reminded us both of the lessons learned from the AIDS crisis, how much we owe to the activism of earlier generations around AIDS, and how much of the idiocy that abounded throughout the context of COVID reflected some questions about the degree to which systems don't really learn lessons. And many of us stand to gain a lot from continuing to have these conversations, particularly as the monkeypox crisis came up again. And so many of the patterns that we saw in early days of AIDS came back to the fore, in contrast to the sense that the COVID crisis was something in which we all had a hand in shaping the outcome. So what we're going to do today is going to be divided into two slight moments or different moments. An initial moment in which Pato and colleagues and friends, George Ayala and Jaime Cortez will share some thoughts. Pato will tell us a little more specifically about the framing of those moments and the whys and hows of those interventions. We'll see how things feel by the time we are through those three initial interventions. We might need to take a collective break or breath, people to get up and go about their business for 5 or 10 minutes. And we'll come back for a second part that will be led or facilitated by Alexandra Juhasz, and we'll count with the interventions by Alex herself as well as J.D. David. I want to say something about Corpus specifically by way of introduction and prefatory to what will follow. One of the reasons George and I first began the conversation had to do with an email, a set of emails that went through from George to Jaime to Pato, related to one of the documents that emerged from what I think is a pretty historic set of collaborations between Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York City and AIDS Project Los Angeles. It's a publication that is a very near and dear publication to my heart called Sexilio, which is not Corpus, but it's related to Corpus, and it stands on its own as an incredible, extraordinary artifact. And Pato and I were having this discussion. It was about where all those publications were from that era. I came of age as a gay man, very much sort of in the thick of a 1.5 generation kind of cohort of AIDS warriors, if you will, who were shaped by the near memory of trauma and loss that was characterizing our many of our elders, particularly those of us who, like me, were lucky enough to have gay parents, who were not seeing death directly in the way that the folks in the generations of the decades of the 80s and early 90s were experiencing. And who also witnessed in the context of HIV research that a lot of the work that was being done in AIDS research specifically, as it came to be framed and formulated in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s, was giving a lot of space for cultural expression and cultural activism as part of the work of interventionists like me, and in some ways like Pato. And so as I had those conversations with Pato about Sexile, we were trying to get permissions for the use of some of the images. I asked a very simple question. So where are all of these publications? Because there were so many of them, and I remember not being able to access them through the usual website links that were available, I guess 10 years before, whenever it was that I first accessed them. I knew that the print editions, I had a precious print edition that I hope to find someday hiding among my books, that, they were relatively small print editions. And then Pato simply said, well, the files, I have access to all the files, but they're mainly in my basement or in somebody's basement. There was something about a basement, and it suddenly dawned on me, oh my God, and what would happen if for whatever reason we can't access, Pato's computer or Pato's basement? How come these artifacts, which are so important to the way in which people like me came to understand the AIDS crisis at that particular moment, were not available for broader circulation, with the exception of artifacts that had a breakout circulation like Sexile, which gets taught in classrooms, right? What would happen to Corpus? What would happen to Think Again? What would happen to all of these other fabulous publications that were produced in AIDS? The irony of the history of these publications is that the earlier generation of publications generated by what's been called the Black Gay AIDS Renaissance, people like Marlon Riggs, Access Hemphill, like the In the Life collection, Brother to Brother, many of those publications were produced in the context of AIDS, fights around AIDS and visibility and all that stuff in an earlier moment by many people who had I would say, lateral or marginal relationship to institutions and certainly to AIDS research. The great irony is that it's precisely in the moment when these publications, this kind of important cultural work is capturing a whole different generation, right, within AIDS, that then those materials become they're subject to this very ironic, sad, but not surprising sense of archival precarity. So one of the things that I want to kind of share as a way of opening the conversation is how crucial it continues to be for many of our communities, as quote unquote mainstream as they may appear to be, even in the context of something like this, to keep on pushing to make sure that the archival work gets to where it needs to get for purposes of preservation. And one thing that I would really love putting on the table, especially given who is here tonight, is the question of the archive, and particularly questions related to the precarity of queer archives, particularly as we try to look at the correspondence, the continuities, and the correlations between COVID, long COVID, and the history of AIDS. So without further ado, I'll pass the mic or the virtual what is it, the platform, if you will, to my friend and colleague and co-conspirator, Pato Hebert. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Carlos, and huge thanks to you and Dolores and the Institute for hosting us. Can you all see a grid of 7 covers? Yes. Okay. So just want to say what a treat it is to be with this group of people thinking together, imagining, remembering, and holding, as you said, Carlos, the precarity, but also the vitality and richness, I think, of this archive. I think as we can see from the current horrors that continue to unfold, the importance of funding healthcare, not warfare, and what happens when the intensification of war, both in domestic and transnational, also wreaks havoc and outright destruction on people's lives and the health infrastructures that would help to keep us safe and well. And so I'm holding the time period that we made this work, which was 2003 to 2008, amidst what was then called by the US government the War on Terror, in relationship to the very moment we're in right now. As I said, Corpus came into existence as an HIV prevention art journal in 2003. So this year we're celebrating the 20th anniversary. And as you reminded us, Carlos, Corpus was born out of a community-based HIV organization called AIDS Project Los Angeles, now called APLA Health. And for several of the issues was also in collaboration with Gay Men's Health Crisis, known as GMHC, in New York City, thinking about what it means to hold local stories and wisdom and practices of the body, practices of desire and wellness among queer folks of color in relationship to a national conversation about the direction of our shared response to the pandemic. So there were 7 issues. Each were organized by guest editors. There were 5,000 copies printed of each hard copy issue and distributed by direct mail. So it was a little bit old school. We also had PDFs, but so few people had the bandwidth, literally on their internet connection, that the PDFs were often low res, and we love distributing those for free as well. But the primary way that Corpus found its many audiences was through hard copies. This was happening in the context of a community-based publishing house that Carlos alluded to. It was producing lots and lots of different kinds of publications. So in the lower left corner, you can see 2 comics. One was a collection called Turnover. The second, an amazing graphic novel about the life of phenomenal transgender activist and organizer Adela Vasquez, authored by Jaime Cortez. Also a series of what we would call white papers. So there were policy briefs that we made purposely to look anything but like a white paper, so that we could get ideas circulating with public health officials and government resource gatekeepers, and a series of publications by and for Black gay men and queer folk called the Think Again series. So Corpus is in turn happening inside of a larger publishing effort at the community level. And these in turn were happening inside of an HIV services organization and an education department where there were many kinds of programs. I think we have Ray Fernandez with us, who at that time led our youth organizing project called Empowerment. You see some of our guys in the upper left corner. We had outdoor media campaigns, including with our youth group, Bring All Yourselves on the bottom, and Visionarios, or HIV Visionaries, outdoor billboard campaigns on the top. And then lots of just direct services, community organizing and programming. So I just want to emphasize that the culture production we're going to share with you tonight is really happening inside of a larger series of responses at community level to the pandemic. And again, this is in the aughts, at a time when the federal government was being extraordinarily restrictive on what HIV funding could be utilized for. And I think George will speak to that a little later. So I'm going to take another 5 or 6 minutes to just introduce you to this thing called Corpus that we're celebrating tonight. And then I'll pass to Jaime Cortez, who is the editor of 3 of the 7 issues, who will bring it to life in only the way that he can, as a poet and a visual artist, and a fiction writer and a fabulous person. And then we'll pass to George Ayala, who somehow made space inside of AIDS Inc. and a large-scale HIV public health response for the kind of thing we're about to share with you. And then, as Carlos alluded to, we'll take a breath, and then we get to hear from the incredible Alexandra Juhasz, and J.D. Davids. So after that, we should open for, I think, a thoughtful conversation with folks in the room. We have Lawrence Pato, who's one of the editors. We have several students from my Queer NYC class. We have Adrian Chesser and a few of the contributors to Corpus. So there's a lot of wonderful people in the room. And if you have thoughts or ideas, please drop them in the Q&A. Okay, 7 issues, as I said. Issue number 1 with the cover art by Timothy Cummings, edited by Jaime Cortez. One of the features inside was this beautiful remembrance by Joel Tan about his friend James Sakakura, and you can see the quilt that James's friends and loved ones made for him. And Joel is really thinking about this deep, wonderful friendship that he had, this incredibly painful loss in the 90s, and Joel's own journey around trying to live in relationship to HIV and stay HIV negative, meaning to not catch the virus. And very thoughtful piece. And one of the things that Corpus did was hold image and text in relationship to each other. And each issue had a select number of the texts translated into Spanish, usually by Omar Baños. So here you can see in maroon or dark red, the Spanish translation. Beautiful comic appeared in this first issue by Velasco, looking at the relationship between two Black gay men. Corpus 2 was also edited by Jaime Cortez and featured this beautiful image coming out of park sex culture and using a technology that was quite common at the time in military and government surveillance war imagery called night vision photography. So repurposing this to think about our vision in the dark as we find each other. The comic that came from, this combination of image and text, was called Playfully and Lovingly, The Burning Bush. Also in this issue was a conversation that Jaime had with the artist Alex Doniz. Alex had a series of really beautiful oil and enamel on plexi drawing paintings that he did featuring these images of police with gang members, intentionally trying to be provocative in the face of the kinds of violences from the state that we would see enacted in Los Angeles and elsewhere, and also the ways the community mobilized themselves. And so beautiful interview. And Ricardo Bracho, important writer, wrote this beautiful piece, Riding Side Saddle Through Thug Life, and it was accompanied by a gorgeous body of conceptual photography by Derek Jackson. So just giving you quick hits about the kind of range of authors, sensibilities, imagery, content, and this weave between image and text. Corpus 3, co-edited by the amazing Lawrence Padua and myself, really thinking about Larry's idea of pageantry, which is different than spectacle, a spectacle to be consumed or exotified. Rather, pageantry is when we present for and with each other, and we're making space together through our movements, gestures, fashion, sensibilities. One of the pieces is by the late Horacio Roque Ramirez, who I miss every day. He wrote a beautiful piece about the also deceased and amazing Teresita, who was a really well-known performer and organizer in the San Francisco Bay Area. There she is on the left in one of my favorite images of her. I had a conversation with the incredible Chanel Tresvant, who's long been building Black trans and queer community in Los Angeles, talking about the work that she's done for many years and how a sense of family and queer kin informs what she does. Also had a conversation with David McMillan and Kenny Irvin, as you are starting to hear in my remembrances and my deep emotion that I'm feeling tonight. Kenny is no longer with us. We've lost so many of these folks. They talked about coming up together in Cleveland's underground music scene and queer scene, and then making their way to Los Angeles and a club that David ran for many years called Sissy. These beautiful tattooed leaves by Cirilo Domine. So these are fallen leaves, and then he took the kind of AOL chat rooms and other online Craigslist ads that people were using before we had hookup apps, and then tattooed with little pins and ink people's handles or names, and then some of the language from these rooms. Really beautiful set of conceptual artworks. Incredible Chris Ferreira did this beautiful design of image and text, thinking about kind of surreptitious mask for mask cruising that would happen at spotlights and very common encoded languages of queerness inside of immigrant and working class communities of color. Issue number 4 was edited by Robert Reed Farr and features this gorgeous image by Viet Lee, part of his larger series, Pictures of You, series of gay men, usually in interiors and these intimate domestic spaces. Corpus 5 was edited by amazing Alex Juhasz, who's with us tonight, featured cover art by Emily Roysden. And this issue focused on the relationship between women, gay men, and HIV. Many of the issues had a kind of theme. Robert's issue, which I just showed you, was thinking about the question of aging and what it means to grow older with HIV if you have access to meds and community and support, but also the way age might inform where we are in our lives and in our journey in relationship to the pandemic. Alex's was helping us think more expansively about gender, and she assembled an incredible range of artists and activists and thinkers. This is the table of contents, and it featured an image by Monica Majoli, who was really interested in gay BDSM culture as a way to enact and expand her own lesbian sexuality and the interplay between lesbians and gay men in shaping queer desire. This is a spread from Emily's work. Many of you may recognize The Mask of the famous artist David Wojnarowicz, who did quite a lot of work around HIV and queer survival, public sex, and Emily in turn queering that in this incredible way. And the text that accompanies this body of images is a conversation with the amazing Jean Carlomusto in conversation with Emily. And I won't say much about this because Alex is going to say more later, but this beautiful piece between Juanita and her son Shaw, and the piece is titled Bricks Falling from the Wall That Sex Built, a Mother-Son Conversation. Issue number 6, Jaime and I co-edited, and this one looked at the question of HIV in rural spaces for queer folk, which again, there was internet at this time, but there weren't hookup apps. And so what it meant to be queer in rural spaces and find one another through cultural media was hugely significant, particularly for young people. This is a portrait of Maddie Jim, transgender organizer from the Southwest, Dene, and by her, I think, longtime friend and ongoing HIV organizer and leader, Elton Noswood. They've both done so much leading in the indigenous communities of this country. Beautiful body of self-portraits and pictures of his agrarian farm worker community in Lodi, California. This is Mario Sixto and his bestie growing up. This beautiful, striking, and very unique body of work that Adrian Chesser created called I Have Something to Tell You, and invited a number of friends and people in his community into the portrait studio, and in the process of making a portrait disclosed to each of them that he was now living with HIV. And the images depict their initial reactions as they heard this news from their friend. It's great to have you with us, Adrian. Thank you for this beautiful body of work. And the last issue, and I'll share a couple anecdotes and we'll transition, is Corpus 7, which was edited by the amazing poet Andy Kwan. It's currently based in Sydney, very transnational in his work in HIV and in creative communities. And so this features work from all over the world, including a beautiful body of work by Sunil Gupta called Mr. Malhotra's Party, photographs of contemporary queers in some of the major cities in the Indian subcontinent. I thought I would then share in closing just a couple of the kinds of requests we got over email to give you a sense of the kinds of audiences and communities assembled by Corpus. So somebody wrote from San Francisco, I'm a long-time fan of your fantastic publication. I'm wondering if I could get a copy in the mail. I'm an HIV/STI counselor at St. James Infirmary, so it'd be great to put it on our magazine table. Thanks so much. Someone else said, I work for a very small GLBTQ youth agency in the state of Maine. We're about as far away from LA as one can get, but it looks like we share similar goals nonetheless. A friend of mine in San Francisco recently forwarded me the most recent edition, of Corpus, and I was blown away at how well done it is. I was wondering if it was possible to purchase copies. We live in a relatively rural part of the country, and there are lots of youth here that don't have access to the internet. And when they do, it's often filtered for content at school or the library. We've also got a rising rate of STIs and HIV/AIDS, and thanks to the federal government withholding such education funding because we refused the abstinence-only education model. So thanks for your time. I hope we can work something out. And just two more. I'm a student at Pitzer College. I believe this person might have been a student of Alex Juhasz's at the time, and I'm interning with the Tranny Rockstars project at Children's Hospital, using the language of the street of the day. We're starting a photo project with the youth, which we're hoping to turn into a photo exhibit of their work at the end of the session, and possibly a zine. My professor told me about Corpus and that there's an issue or two with art and photography by some transgender youth. If you have extra copies, I would love to buy some for Tranny Rockstars to show them some work by other trans youth. Please let me know. And of course, Corpus was never for sale, at least in our workings. I find copies on Amazon all the time still, but it was always given out for free by design. And lastly, I was introduced to your magazine by my professor, and I think it's really incredible. I'm writing to see if you or anyone connected to Corpus would be interested in participating on a roundtable panel I'm organized for the 2008 American Studies Association in October in Albuquerque. The title of the panel is American Studies Beyond the Academy, and its purpose is to give grad students an opportunity to talk about careers in social justice, advocacy, museum administration, curating, academic publishing, and public service. We'd be thrilled to include you if you're interested and available. If not, we'd welcome any suggestions you have. So I just thought it might be interesting to see that range of people and the kinds of networks that were circulating through universities, through friends, through service providers, through community organizing. And with that very fast introduction, I will pass the baton to Jaime Cortez, who again edited issues 1, 2, and 6. Jaime, take it away.
Hello, everybody. And it's a pleasure to be here participating on this panel with these amazing people, and just seeing that spread of all the various, the corpi, as we called them in the plural, the corpi all together at once. It just was really moving to me just to remember the arc of that publication as it got passed on from person to person. So it was very sweet to just remember that. As Pato mentioned, I was the kind of founding editor for Corpus, and I would like to read to you today from the introduction to the first issue of it, and it's brief, so not too long here. But here we go. Here's the introduction to issue 1 of Corpus. Greetings. Welcome to decade 3 of AIDS. If you're tired, you should be. 20 years is a long time to be careful and fearful. It's a long time to fight for meds, treatment, and education. It's a long time to crave skin-to-skin communion. It's a long time to partake in gallows humor. It's nowhere near enough time to gather the wisdom necessary to understand how we are going to live, love, and lust in the midst of massive infection, an ever-shifting viral landscape, and the seesawing of a society that can't decide if AIDS should be treated like a disease or a political problem. Nevertheless, some of us are still here, still queer, getting used to it. We're pretty good at surviving, but AIDS is flat out brilliant at it. I'd like to believe that Corpus represents us sashaying on point into the vault of AIDS, stealing the playbook, and learning the lessons of fast-track evolution, memory, contradiction, and complexity. In the past 20 years, epidemiologists, doctors, and scientists have contributed immeasurably to our understanding of HIV/AIDS and have helped the discourse around it. While their contributions have been remarkable, they are incomplete. In Corpus, we address the knowledge gap that can only be filled by artists with their particular field research that is irreproducible but constantly duplicated, unverifiable but full of truth. I like this part of the HIV response spectrum. I like it because I want to learn new strains of faggotry. I like it because I want to see queer male life strategies transmitted and reproduced with virulence. I want pathology reports, Ms. Thang. I want to know we're present even when undetectable. I want us to survive in the millions. I thank AIDS Project Los Angeles for allowing me to work on this publication and for providing the resources necessary to make it so beautiful. I thank the writers and the artists for their words, images, and ideas that give me nourishment and even hope. I hope it is contagious. So that was the introduction to Corpus 1.
Thank you, Jaime. Pass now to George, who made all of this possible through his leadership and advocacy.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see that? Great. Good evening, everyone. We didn't make Corpus with the thought that it would transcend time. And although it was a 2003 response to an increasingly conservative and biomedicalized HIV field, Corpus held the DNA of cultural production trailblazers in the HIV space. Proyecto Contra el SIDA por Vida being one. Something to Say, Sissy Speak, Behind Our Backs, Faggot Sex being another. Just a short thanks to the activists behind these and other similar initiatives who are and continue to be my teachers. Thank you. the political moment in which we worked compelled us to art and cultural production as fundamental participatory, communal, meaning-making tools. Corpus was meant to reveal and to disrupt. We ruffled feathers and caused many eyebrows to rise higher than I thought was humanly possible. AIDS Inc., a la CDC, NIH, and the Los Angeles Department of Health Services were dismayed. And although we were given a lot of latitude at AIDS Project Los Angeles, where Pato and I worked and helped, and we made to, we together were made to make the case for why this was important for each issue, every issue, until the series ended in 2008, when the last corpus was published. Community activists fought for improved treatment options from the very beginning of the epidemic. And I wanted to just kind of take a moment to say that, you know, I hear a lot these days that, you know, COVID was kind of a once in a lifetime world pandemic. And that's just not true when I reflect on the HIV pandemic, which, by the way, is still going on. Although the advent of effective antiretroviral medications in 1996 was heralded, many community organizers were worried that a singular focus on pills would steamroll community-led initiatives that meaningfully engage and welcome people living with and most affected by HIV to be central to the response. And it did. Epidemiologists became obsessed with incessant fuck counting, whilst rendering gay, bi men and trans people invisible. Public health lenses reduced people to behaviors and to euphemisms. We were consenting subjects in clinical trials. Queer people became unwelcomed in the response unless we were willing to subject ourselves. Partly because biomedical tools could only be wielded by medical doctors. And as part of the professionalization of the field, there were fewer and fewer opportunities to get our grassroots homegrown programs funded. After all, those programs promoted sex, and they were too explicit. They were too gay. We need evidence to justify the existence of community-led programs, we would be told. And we still do. We're still being told that. In 2003, in the foreword of the inaugural issue of Corpus, I wrote, "These days, finding gayness in HIV/AIDS industry is like looking for Waldo. Gay has become backdrop to vague social categories like MSM, which stands for men who have sex with men, same gender loving, and men on the DL. One of the great ironies of the AIDS era, or perhaps logical outcome, is an inordinate attention given to understanding the biology of HIV in the body without regard to the bodies hosting the virus. We in the industry have devoted so little theorizing to how we as gay men inhabit our bodies in relationship to sex, identity, culture, social interaction, and HIV. It is in this spirit that we introduced Corpus. APLA is launching Corpus as part of a series of new publications designed to stimulate public debate and to encourage a renewed sense of possibility within the AIDS industry. Corpus is a collection of writings and artwork devoted to gay sex, not as a problem to be solved or behavior to be quantified, but as a platform from which to launch more sophisticated and nuanced explorations of desire, pleasure, culture, HIV, and the challenges living with multiplicity. Corpus stood out from the mainstream HIV space. Corpus invited readers to resist the ways AIDS industry pathologized queer people's lives and bodies. Corpus was an invitation to gay, bi, trans, and queer people to tell stories about desire, pleasure, gender, age, class, race, place. As a strategy to make meaning of HIV and its disproportionate impact on low-income Black and brown queer people, in 2004, I wrote, Corpus is about the sex gay men have, how we feel about our sex, how we perform the beautifully broad range of masculinities and femininities inside our sex, and how we seek to experience and learn about our own and each other's bodies before, during, and after our sex. Sometimes our sex happens to be irreverent and celebration, communion, and joy, and at other times in the silence of self-reflection, of poetry and anonymous park sex. We have acquired genius, proclaims Corpus editor Jaime Cortez. Seldom is that genius tapped. More often than not, gay men and our sex get reduced to ridiculously simple characterizations, or even worse, get erased. Contributions didn't have to be accomplished. Contributors of Corpus didn't have to be accomplished researchers, epidemiologists, clinicians, or authors, although a few were. Corpus was a creative act of defiance against an industry intent on defining and containing, with little say from those of us living with or most affected by HIV. Corpus was a strategy for retaking HIV discourse. Corpus centered and celebrated Black and brown people. Corpus was a pre-social media 8x8-inch object of beauty meant to be held, handled, studied, caressed, and come back to us again and again for renourishment. Its presence mattered like our bodies matter. Corpus is ever-giving. It lingers, remains, sequesters, and returns. Corpus was both censored and held, much in the same way that our bodies have been. Corpus stands as a fierce refusal to allow the lives and sex of queer people to be flattened, as is often and sadly the case in our efforts to prevent HIV transmission. We acknowledge the beautifully diverse ways we are present in and show ourselves to the world. We pondered our smart, complicated performances of gender, race, class, through the sex that we have. Together, we imagine communities of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender folk lovingly nudging each other to show up for social change. A world without HIV requires this of us because poverty, racism, sexism, homophobia, and stigma continue to fuel the epidemic. Now 20 years since the first publication of Corpus, Corpus's importance is worth revisiting. Thank you.
Carlos, do you want to offer any reflections that bookend your kind of introductory comments and what you've just heard?
Well, thank you to the three of you for phenomenal interventions. I wanted to address two specific things that came up for me as I listened to you. One of them is the degree to which we still need the print, because of the kinds of socialities that are possible through print publication and circulation that unfortunately appear to be unnecessary once we shifted, as we did so drastically, toward PDF and document sharing in other formats. I spent part of my time in rural Pennsylvania, and I keep thinking, if some of these publications showed up inadvertently in somebody's library, public library, what kind of work, cultural work would they do? Would they perform in connecting folk to ways of imagining their life that are not available otherwise, right? That they can't even, that they may not be able to name. And how many, how many little queerlings show up in libraries, not just there, but in our own hoods, in our own communities, right? Needing that, you know, that random access to those incredible sites in Sexilio or in Corpus itself at the local library that barely, escaped censorship of some kind and simply got integrated. So I'm thinking about that sociality of printed textual matter as being crucial to queer survival still, right? Even though we've performed this major shift, which is something that's experienced unevenly. And of course, a lot of queerlings, proto queer children, may be afraid of typing things up in the fear that mom and dad may actually go to the historical and find whatever it is that they're looking for. What if they just show up at the library and access that? And the other comment that I want to make, and I want to throw it in, I recall that part of my training as an AIDS researcher and engaged citizen or whatever had to do with a very specific view of culture that was more about cultural containment, the kind of parlaying of stereotypes about how Latino men and Black men had sex, or how homophobic the communities of color were. And I actually became an AIDS person involved in this world through a program that was specifically deploying culturalist paradigms to attempt to address something called behavior change, right? Which at the outset was understood there was no behavioral intervention that actually showed that this cultural stuff didn't make any difference. Yet there was the gimmick was that it was going to happen, right? And that the culturalist intervention was supposed to address the issues that the investigators suggested informed the kinds of elements that came together in Latino communities and that increased risk, right? That vision of culture, which tends to be packaged and circulated in public health, and many of us are very familiar with it because it still circulates, it's still prevalent. I think of it as the machismo, marianismo, familismo, Latinx complex of whatever. That matrix of amazing, skin the color of mocha Latinidad in health research, contrasted to a more insurgent, rebellious, dissenting view of cultural expression, which is what Corpus signified. So I hope we get to talk a little bit about this, particularly to hear a bit more from George, Jaime, and Pato precisely about how this must have been quite a fight, right? To present, to defend a view of culture that basically disabused everyone of the notion that people of color were somehow sort of generating these bottled and stereotypical sort of codes, right? So I'll leave it at that for now.
Tell us how you really feel, Carlos.
Girl. That was my life for a long time.
I understand.
With that nonsense. I mean, and taking it seriously, because it's not even, I mean, we all know it's BS, but then you don't get grants unless you kind of circulate and recirculate these things. So there's a way in which these stereotypes, I mean, it's right out of Oscar Lewis, right? And it gets completely incorporated into the infrastructures to the point that they're expecting you to proffer all this nonsense in the process of evaluating applications. And of course, you have to produce that if you're going to do something dissenting. So where is the balance of that? I'm sure you guys had a field day of experiences precisely with this kind of thing.
Well, I'll say two things, and then George, I want to hear your thoughts, and I have a thought of bridging to the question of print with Jaime. But two things that made me feel like we were succeeding is when prisons would take back the copies as pornography. So that made me feel like it was succeeding on one level. And then there was a well-known gathering by the CDC in Atlanta, and many community groups would put their materials out, right? The signifying that my information uses the right language, et cetera, Carlos. And editions of Corpus were put out on those tables at the start of one of the plenaries. And by the time our person came back out, they'd all been confiscated and censored by the CDC folks. So those are two very different contexts, right? And for slightly different but very related reasons, how the surveilling and the censoring and the control was being enacted on the body of the publication itself. But George, you had to navigate this diplomacy of speaking as a well-trained and extremely erudite social scientist, but also somebody who was taking to task the kinds of languages and restrictions that Carlos is talking about. I think you read that beautifully in your forward. Do you want to say anything about the difficult dances of getting each of these issues into the world?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say here on this topic, and Carlos, I appreciate that you raised it. And Pato, you know, we were at a conference where we were at I remember it so clearly. We were at a kind of a luncheon, like the launch of the conference or something, and there was a big luncheon hall, one of those hotel conference spaces, and they had the round tables set up, and we placed copies of Corpus on everybody's seat. Not only did CDC personnel, not only were they instructed to lift and take away copies of Corpus that were there, they were instructed to throw them in the garbage. And at some point, you know, staff, I don't know, I don't remember I don't know if you remember this, but we were frantically trying to fish them out of garbage bins to salvage as many of them as we could. And you know, that tells the story, right? Like I do feel like what we were trying to do was so threatening to the status quo of the industry that people really wanted to censor us because they didn't want to understand that there were multiple ways of getting at knowledge and generating knowledge and sharing knowledge, right? That we didn't have to have randomized control trials to say something was working, and that our communities weren't monolithic, right? Like to your point about stereotypes, like we were complicating in all of our issues, race and gender, sexuality. We were complicating, look, you know, where we come from, where we were raised. We were doing all of that stuff. We were speaking intersectionality before that term became sexy in the halls of academia, right? And I think it was threatening, and people felt in academic circles and even public health circles that it was too soon. It threatened my job if you're doing this, and you know, and it's resonating in a way that my randomized control trial behavioral intervention is not, right? And so I think it, for me, it was an important lesson in power, right? And the fact that these kinds of things necessarily have to butt against, you know, power structures.
Yeah, you, Jaime, in your introduction, you have this beautiful line about the peculiar knowledge and ways that artists work, right? To your point, George, and we have lots of folks on the call. Ted Kerr, one of our most amazing HIV thinkers and leaders, I think, in the world right now, and often grounding it in community response and cultural production, and listening to the voices of the people who may not necessarily have fancy letters or positions. We have Professor Ronak Kapagya, who does amazing curatorial work. Ray Fernandez and Lawrence Padua, who continue to work inside of difficult community health and community-based organization spaces, doing great work every day. So there's a lot of different folks who are doing the work every single day still. And Jaime, you're not going to like me doing this, but you have an amazing book of short fiction out called Gordo. And I wonder if you want to speak to Carlos's question about print, because I feel like you've been living a really vibrant life of print, and not even image and text in print, but just the power of text and storytelling. And you gave us just a little hit of your formidable prose and ability to bring language to life. But do you want to speak to why print then and why now, and what it's been like for you to live such a powerful public life as a gay brown man in print?
You know, my fondness for the printed object feels increasingly quaint to me as kind of culture moves more and more away from the object and towards that which is kind of digitized and can be efficiently transmitted electronically. And you know, we live in screens so much more than we used to. Nevertheless, I do think that there's something there about it that I continue to cleave to. I think sometimes about Corpus and, you know, the choices we made around, you know, just little design choices, making it a square format so that it looked like something a bit different. The fact that, you know, George and Pato were able to scramble and pull together the resources to make it a beautiful, glossy, richly colored journal. And I think sometimes about how, you know, in Japan, they have this expression that, you know, when somebody puts a beautiful meal before you, you talk about first you eat with your eyes. And I think that there's something about that really sticks with me in terms of the look and feel of Corpus, the heft of it, the square format, the beautiful glossy paper. Before you ever open it, you know that you are looking at something that someone really cared about this thing. There's a lot of care evident in it. There's a lot of, before you open it, you know somebody cared about this publication, somebody poured time and resources and thought into it. That's before you ever crack the book open even. And I think that for me felt really special. You know, George talked about it, this publication literally being thrown into the garbage after all of that care and love had been poured into it, right? And the affirmation of just saying your sexuality and all of that complicated, contradictory life that surrounds it, it matters so much that we want to kind of enshrine it in this beautiful format. And I think there's something about that that's still special to me. And I think it's special to other people because I know that people cherish objects still. However much we might continue to invest more and more of our life in the virtual, people still really appreciate objects, and it means something beyond just the content that the book might contain. The materiality speaks above and beyond the object itself, and so I do kind of keep that in mind. And I also just want to piggyback a little bit on something that George was saying, is that I think one of the things that was, I don't know that we ever laid this down like in a manifesto of any kind, but the embrace of the contradictory was a really important part of the work. You know, I was skimming the first issue. We have in there a beautiful essay by Joel Tan called The Undetectable Strain. And in that story, he talks about this period of his life. He was young, he was in his mid-20s, and his 4 closest friends all died within close succession of each other. And that's like 4 universes imploding, right, for him. And how he almost needed to be positive as well. He needed to be HIV positive as well, to be with them somehow. And, you know, that is such a complicated moment. And it's such a, you know, in some ways there's a contradiction of having this thirst to go on with life, but also just almost wanting to invoke this very serious illness so that you can be with your beloveds, if only in, you know, maybe not even in death, but just in living and being with them. And I think there's something in that moment that really kind of, from issue one, it really set the tone that like life is fucking complicated. And we have these thought patterns that we come up with as a way of trying to make meaning and trying to move forward under extreme duress. And that was something that was, I think, really important. And as George mentioned, I think that is, I can see how that's really profoundly threatening to to a public health kind of, from a public health perspective in some ways, to say, yeah, you get to have these impulses that might feel self-negating, or even some would say suicidal. You get to have those. And this is it's just part of the spectrum of response to these circumstances. So I'll just leave it with that thought.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that art does, Jaime, in its many forms, whether it's poetry or dancing together at 3 a.m. or these beautiful paintings, Georgia shared many of them, is it makes room for that somatic and emotional spectrum that we live on and in, and often within the very same sex act or conversation or fight or, subway ride, etc. I've mentioned Ray a few times, who ran our youth program, and about 10 years after that program had to end due to funding cuts, Ray and I gathered 6 of the young gay men of color who had gone through that program to talk about what they experienced together at the time and where their lives were then, meaning in the future at age, I don't know, early 30s, mid 30s. And one of the aspects of the program was a journal, Carlos, just a simple little thing you'd get at Duane Reade or Walgreens, that Ray would hand out with pens, and they would keep them as journals because, of course, nobody had their Instagram feeds or their TikToks yet. This is pre-social media. And then they bring them in twice a week and show them to each other and pass them around, almost like people would do with yearbooks. And they would talk about them as their queer yearbook, and they were constantly filling them up in these beautiful collages. So one of them, Enzo Ibarra, is an incredible artist to this day, and was saying, man, that was our Facebook, and it was way better than a like, much better than a like. And in some ways, he was articulating his own ethos of why print. And the print here is $1.50 notebook, right? And anything you want to put inside of it. It doesn't have to be super glossy or fancy, though of course it can be. And the shrines that they would make for each other at 16, 18, 20, 21, surviving getting fag bashed on the way, surveilled by the security at the building where we were running the program, struggling, with police entrapment, literally, and then we'd have to work with them to deal with their legal cases. And that they made the case for print every day with their bodies, Carlos, the way that the print was, in the language of now, a kind of receipts of our lived lives. And you didn't take the bait, Jaime, but I'll say that I'm very moved that a book of short stories is having the kind of life around the country that your book is. And it reaffirms for me that when people come with this warmth and care in hand, it does something. The books have a weight in our hand. And I say that as somebody who's on my screens all the time, and I love multiple forms of modalities, including the digital. But this happened in a moment right before the digital took such supremacy.
Yeah.
I think, I'll pause because since you want to jump back in.
Yeah, no, thank you. Regarding the book, it was an interesting thing. The book, my collection of short stories called Gordo was slated to be released in the summer of 2020. And of course, whatever plans any of us had for 2020 kind of got torched, right? And so the book ended up having its publication date pushed back into 2021, and the initial kind of author events and stuff around it were mostly kind of virtual. And it was this interesting combination of virtual events with readers and audience members who in many cases had the physical object with them, and they would hold it up on the screen. And it was this weird kind of hybrid of this kind of the joy of the object. And it's the only reason I know of that joy of the object was because of the virtual. So there's a kind of a coexistence that was happening there. But yes, there's still that joy of the object. And people constantly send me pictures of like, oh, here I am at the airport in Portland, and here's your book face out in the bookstore. And it's just funny to see the book out in the wild like that. So yeah.
George, did you want to say something else?
No, the only other reflection that I have here on print material is that, what makes print unique also is that, we could have a relationship with it, a very personal relationship with it. That's not true with, you know, internet or, you know, things that we come upon digitally. You know, I love grabbing a book early in the morning as part of my meditation practice. And I fall in love with books, you know, and I can't say that to be the case when I'm, you know, perusing things digitally.
Yeah, I think we've designed tonight's program to give everybody on the call a sense of what Corpus was, just so we're sharing a kind of similar set of reference points or touchstones. And the second part of the program to think about Corpus into the now. I mean, George, you helped lead Alameda County's response to MPOX over a couple of Pride seasons and beyond. And in our next set of fabulous folks is helping us think about Corpus in relationship to the now, because the work of cultural production is ongoing. And as I think's already been said on the call, HIV is absolutely still with us and ongoing. And I think that I just saw a statistic, and JD, you may know better than me, but I think that more than half of the people living with HIV in this country are now over 50. And even at the same time that we have to keep addressing infection rates among our young people. So Robert was ahead of that with Corpus 4 and thinking about the question of aging and being middle-aged and now senior while living with HIV, which just a generation prior had not been held in the same way. And I say that even at pains to remind us that not everybody was killed, right? Not everybody died, even as so many of us experienced the kind of evisceration that you spoke of, Jaime, that Joel did, losing 4 of his closest friends, whole universes. And so the moment when that we're in, and the teaching that Ronak does, or the day-to-day public health bureaucratic grind that Larry leads, or the counseling and mental health that Ray guides in Los Angeles, or the incredible range of cultural production that Ted Kerr generates in community and collectivity, are ways that this work is absolutely of the present too. So just want to point that as we maybe start our transition to the second program, that this isn't simply a dusty, nostalgic looking back, but it's a really urgent thinking forward into the now. Where is the work of us and HIV, cultural production, print and digital, and any other modality that we need to marshal to keep surviving these syndemics, these multiple pandemics together? Do we want to take a little 5-minute kind of screen off disability justice exhale? And I'm showing 6:16 on the East Coast, 3:16 on the West Coast. Shall we come back in 5 at 21 after the hour, and then we'll hear from Alex? Thanks, everyone. Okay, everyone, I want to welcome you back gently from our very brief break. In a different universe moment, I would have been playing some music on the interlude, but we had a little Zoom poltergeist take over the start of our time together tonight. So I just thought the quiet might be a little helpful. I want to say a couple of things. I know that we also have friends and loved ones and playmates on the call. So I want to welcome all of you and thank you for being here. And I have the great privilege of co-teaching a class called Queer NYC with the amazing Gayatri Gopinath, who was scheduled to be with us tonight in the second part of the call, and unfortunately due to health reasons can't join us. So she sends her love. I want to send her a get well wish. And I want to just shout out 4 of our students who are with us. We have Anna, Carol, Grisel, and Abby. And I just need to say to the call and with all of you as witness, I have the great privilege of being pushed and challenged and delighted and in community with this group of young people all semester long. And to me, the work is ongoing. And one of the gifts of what we're doing tonight and what we each do in our spaces is make the possibility of intergenerational play and wisdom and continuity. And it's a very sacred thing that I'm quite grateful for, including our 2 folks in the second part of this evening's program, Alexandra Juhasz and JD Davids, both of whom do amazing work every day on multiple fronts, against war, holding space for long COVID, and thinking about other chronic illnesses and disabilities, both of them serving as leaders and educators, both at a popular education level and also structurally and institutionally. And I've had the great pleasure of being a collaborator and conspirator with both of you in many, many forms. Alex, you and I have worked around HIV for a long, long time together, and was really so grateful that you accepted the invitation to edit what became issue number 5 that I showed a few images. So I'll pass to you as you embark on this second part of the evening for us.
So thank you for the invitation. And just because maybe you have a little COVID brain fog, not only did we collaborate on HIV and continue to do so as members of what would an HIV doula do collective and otherwise, which JD is a member of, Ted Kerr, and maybe some others in the chat. But you and I have been working on long COVID and COVID since the beginning of that ongoing pandemic. And we both started long hauling together in April of 2020. So what I'm going to do is make a brief comment to transition. I'm going to pass the mic to JD. And I'm going to return and speak for a second and then open the floor up, perhaps first maybe ask a few questions of the panelists and then open the floor up for conversation. I don't think this will take all that long though. But what I did want to at least start with was a question that Pato raised at the beginning that we haven't really talked about yet, which is this question of what to do with archives. And, you know, that this is now an archival object that is or is not being cared for, that maybe this is part of the care, that more care will occur when George and Pato publish a book about Corpus. But I want to think out loud with you all a little bit about what to do with archives and what we're doing with archives today, really. And again, do that in honor of a lot of the thinking that I also do with Ted Kerr in our book. We were having this conversation now, The Times of AIDS Cultural Production, where we do a lot of things. But one of the things that we do is think about what it is that we do with objects from the past. Not simply to put them in amber, not simply to make sure that they last, although that's important, but to jettison them into the present with a kind of activist stewardship for a number of reasons. And one is that, of course, we can learn from the people before that, the people before us who are often as brilliant as we are or more brilliant than we are. And it's a really kind of stupid way that we think about people of the past, even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and we're talking about HIV AIDS, that they aren't as sophisticated as we are. And, you know, it's so belittling as a person who started in HIV in 1987 and was, you know, the same person I am now. So I'm as smart now as I was then, and maybe more smart then because I was younger and my brain was more fertile. Our archives don't just help us learn, they help us feel. And so the resonance that comes from these objects that have been saved, we were talking about, Jaime was talking about everyone's been talking the preciousness of this book and why people save things, because something with our body happens when we save things and hold them. And we feel, but we also learn how other people felt, and that produces sometimes solace and sometimes anger, sometimes inspiration. So the somatic experience that archives produce as human beings who know that we want connection from people from the past is extremely important. And I think that, of course, we remember, but the most important things about archives and working with archival materials, saving them, holding them, passing them on, is to use them. They inspire us with the ferocity that they hold, especially these kinds of archives that we're talking about. I really heard George say that. That ferocity doesn't go away. That ferocity is still fierce. And we can tap into that. It's right there for us in these archival materials. So I'm excited to regenerate this. And in the book that I wrote with Ted, we have the word now in the title because we are alive now. We're lucky to be so. We remember those who didn't get to come to this time with us, but we are alive now and we're working on the now. So there's a hope to not just get mired in nostalgia or grief, although of course those are human and useful when they are, but to be with the past in the present because it illuminates and inspires us now. And HIV is now, long COVID is now, and we are here now. And these materials are with us now. And I think that's what's so exciting and so generative about Corpus in particular. I mean, just seeing the images, whew, my goodness. I mean, you could just sit with those images for a few days and remember how to be alive. So thank you for those of you who were sharing those images. I'm going to pass it on to JD, who's going to come from a different angle to these materials, and then I'll come behind him after his remarks. So thanks again, and I look forward to hearing from you, JD.
Thanks. I'm so honored and excited to be here, and I wrote a thing to say as much as possible because I have a lot to say. And now my screen's gone blank. Oh, here, one moment. The poltergeists have now gone into Google Docs. I'm so grateful for everyone who's with us tonight. And I'm also grateful for all those who are not here tonight because you're taking care of yourselves or caring for others. Because when we are elders is the word I use for the many of us who are chronically ill and sharing the wisdoms of our lives. Often our work and our contribution is our resting, is our not doing, is our undoing the lies of the false binary of healthy and productive and giving and good versus sick and incapable and needy and bad. As we know, as trans, non-binary, and queer people, all binaries are false. Because as we're reminded by those fighting for the caring economy, we will all give and receive care in our lives. Caregiving, which is devalued as female, as femme, as immigrant, as unpaid or low-paid labor, is actually the core of being human. When we care for ourselves, for each other, we're doing the work of being human, even if it's not the work honored by racist, capitalist patriarchy. So thank you for caring for yourselves and each other, even if it meant you weren't here tonight. In our short time together, I'll take my turn to share the experience of feeling like a part of me returned to myself when the set of Corpus journals came to me last month, packed into a small box made heavy. I'll dip briefly into that which is mentioned often in my worlds, yet not often done deeply or to my liking, which is to consider the parallels between the HIV and COVID pandemics, including the long COVID crisis. And I'll ask you to consider your actions and responsibilities in an ongoing airborne pandemic that spurs or worsens disability and chronic illness as long COVID, which currently affects 6% of all adults in the United States, with a likely 4-fold higher risk to people living with HIV and the highest rates in the United States in transgender people. Corpus reminds me in the best of ways and in the hardest of ways of our central call to action in long COVID justice, where Pato is on our advisory team. Pandemics are chronic. Reopening issue 1 felt like coming home and also brought up big feelings of loss and sadness. As my dead ex-brother-in-law John used to say, it hit me where I used to live. I became sexually active the same year AIDS was recognized and was at high behavioral and biological risk in the 80s, an abused AFAB adolescent looking for connection and escape, with eventually more than 100 mostly condomless male partners, but low risk due to my white race and my suburban upper middle class demographic. I didn't get HIV. My whiteness still protects me. In 2022, CDC tells us, quote, estimates suggest 94% of white people who could benefit from PrEP, like I did and do, have been prescribed it, with only 13% of Black and 24% of Hispanic Latino people who could benefit have been prescribed PrEP, unquote. As if this weren't disparate and disturbing enough, we can look at CDC's October Dear Colleague letter that highlights this data and see there's not a single mention of trans people, despite all the evidence that trans people, particularly Black and brown trans women and femmes, have very, very high rates of HIV. When it comes to the other pandemic, most or perhaps all of you have heard nothing from LGBTQ organizations or HIV organizations about the reality that trans and also bisexual people have the very highest rates of long COVID in the US, as seen time and again in the US Household Pulse Survey of the Census Bureau. Long COVID justice and trans equity, the only groups I know of that has publicized this troubling fact, delved into the reasons and implications in our Long COVID is a Trans Issue online gathering a few weeks back. So I hope you'll check that out. It's easy enough to say everyone is busy and underfunded, and that certainly doesn't help, but that's not the reason. We do what we need to, or at least try to, funding or otherwise. Is it the historical alliance with the Democrats encouraging them to question no further and to be no better than most of the general American public that's been denied accurate, life-saving, and disability-preventing information and tools on COVID and long COVID? Is it the internalized ableism and stigma, not just for the HIV that may be in one's body or community, but also for the entrenched biases against disability and illness that in some ways may resonate even more strongly in HIV communities, where everyone is supposed to be dancing and climbing mountains, living their best lives on ARVs, like in ads on Hulu. Whatever the reasons, we know these omissions, minimizations, and denials deaden and kill us. Corpus filled these kinds of silences and gaps with life, color, breath, art, sex. We needed it then, and we need it now. As Angela Marquez Vasquez, MSW, writes in Still on the Margins, Long COVID Patients of Color, a new guest post on Alice Wong's Disability Visibility blog, we know that COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted communities of color, both economically and in terms of their health. This means there are likely millions of long COVID patients who, because of income, immigration status, digital inequities, or discrimination in healthcare, remain unidentified, unsupported, or otherwise marginalized with their new disabilities by the healthcare system, employers, schools, and the broader organized grassroots movements for long COVID and disability justice, end quote. We don't get to pick our pandemics. I urge us to recognize the long COVID crisis in our lives and loves, even as HIV persists, and as those who wish us ill, at times literally, are on the offensive. In 2003, I remember wandering around talking on my Nokia phone as a handful of us pulled together a national HIV policy group that became the Federal AIDS Policy Partnership. The membership wasn't public. This was the time in which groups were getting audited by the Bush administration. One auditor came to the offices of Us Helping Us, People Into Living, the DC Black Gay-centered HIV group, and by way of introduction, brought out a Bible. In my mind's retelling of the story, it is always in the voice of Ron Simmons, PhD, the longtime executive director, and the Bible lands on the desk with an echoing thud, bam. Corpus is a through line, not only of 20 years of sustained injustice and inequity, but of flourishing life-sustaining community and culture amidst unrelenting racial injustice, anti-queer and anti-trans violence, and increasingly, or persistently, trans erasure. In the long COVID movement, I often cite the set of federally supported HIV programs, from Ryan White care programs to housing to research and more, as a model for what we need to confront the long COVID crisis. Yet even this foundational, wildly successful set of programs, which need expansion to do more and go where they have not yet succeeded, are now under genuine attack in these awful, deadly foothills of fascism we find ourselves in. It was fear of politics and also pervasive stigma, judgment, and self-shame that puritanized HIV efforts at the time of Corpus's birth. The massive apparatus around HIV that existed by that time in 2003 was strangely almost devoid of actual discussion of sex, as has been mentioned here tonight. The lived experiences, the loved experiences, the fucked experiences of sex as it lives and breathes and sustains and compels and confuses and clarifies us, barely mentioned. That year, we also started CHAMP, the Community HIV/AIDS Mobilization Project, which adopted the slogan, put the sex and drugs back into HIV prevention. Now we're in another time where we not only do not talk about sex or how to navigate risk and relationships in a fucking airborne pandemic, we don't even really talk about sickness or acute illness, let alone disability or chronic illness. Back in early 2020, but still today, there was and is very little actual information online or in the news or from providers about what to actually do to care for yourself or loved ones when you get COVID. Doesn't it seem strange that there was and is so very little information on how to treat symptoms, how to rest, how to treat a fever, how to soothe a burning cough or throat? We were supposed to get sick for 2 weeks, then die or go back to life, with no guidance for caring for ourselves or each other for that fortnight, and certainly nothing about what to do when we were still sick, or differently or more sick, days to weeks to months, and now years later. This is not necessarily by design, but it's not a mistake. We are not supposed to expect answers or help in this ongoing pandemic. Now, when we're all supposed to go out and get COVID over and over and pretend it's allergies or, this weird flu, there's still virtually no information. Sound familiar? If you don't have long COVID, or don't yet recognize that's why you've been having trouble remembering or thinking clearly or reacting to all kinds of food or unable to sleep, getting dizzy, unable to get it up, or your monthly cycle's gone haywire or returned after years of menopause, or so many, many other things. You may not know there's virtually no information on how to live with it or what the hell to do about it. There's even a myth, even repeated by some long COVID advocates, that there's no treatment for long COVID. What they mean is correct. There's no one cure, no one central effective treatment or combo of treatments like we now have for HIV. And I don't mean to minimize how far we have to go in finding and scaling up effective treatment for what can be severe, life-threatening, and even fatal consequences of infection-associated chronic conditions like long COVID, chronic Lyme, and others. But there is a lot that can help many people feel better or do better as chronically ill and disabled people, and that can save lives. There's been virtually no effort to get anyone this information outside struggling groups of sick and disabled volunteers or small groups like mine. It's like 1983 more than 2003 in HIV pandemic time in that regard. And while some things have improved a lot in HIV, without enough resources and practices and dialogue like Corpus modeled, there's still huge gaps in HIV, and those that have been partially filled have taken years. I'm grateful to groups and networks of people living with HIV and sex positive and harm reduction groups that make these discussions happen, and that recently forced the National HIV/AIDS Strategy to add a goal of assessing and improving the actual quality of lives of people living with HIV, not just maintaining viral suppression. But we need to remember there was clear, compelling evidence of undetectable equals untransmittable back in 2011. Yet it took many, many years more of people living with HIV and allies fighting governments to share this vital, game-changing news. It's still not commonplace knowledge like it should be in order to free hearts, minds, relationships, and to smash HIV criminalization. And PrEP, equally overwhelmingly effective, also delayed by years to be clearly promoted on its own merits, not as an adjunct to the condoms I and others weren't and aren't using. And now still out of reach to most of those in need, unless they're white men, and not even known about by so many who would rest more easily and fuck more pleasurably if they did. In the COVID pandemic, the relationship between the air around us and the cells inside our body achieved intimate proportions, affecting our life chances for breath itself, for the energy to pursue our desires, to live our dreams, or just to make it through another day as a parent, a partner, a worker with rent coming due. Yet there's little to no discussion about navigating bodies and relationship and all this air between and among us. On March 11th, 2020, I published How to Have Sex in the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic, subtitled Ideas for Sexy Social Distancing, because sex that's good for you is good for you. It's still relevant. I've got so much more to share about that and not much time to do so tonight. But in the hot spirit of Corpus, let me tell you, I feel like I've won the T for T queer kink dystopian lottery over the past 4 years of this pandemic. As I explained back in the How to Have Sex piece, good sex is a cornerstone of my elder life. I get exercise from it. I bathe my weary joints and muscles and bones in happy chemicals. I have something I get to do without overthinking. I'm good at it. And I continue to learn more about the power of pleasure to clear my heart and mind, steadying myself for the more difficult aspects of this life. Today, and for the last 4 years and more, I live with my incredibly hot and creative, disabled and chronically ill trans partner in a New York City apartment that's big enough to have boundaries for my own digital-based delights in the app and cam era. Plus, I regularly have treasured time with several beloved and gorgeous, ongoing COVID-cautious, chronically ill and disabled partners, and a well-honed and footnoted shared Google Doc protocol on using layered prevention practices, timing, and testing for any potential air sharing among or between us. But what makes me even more of a unicorn is the outdoor PCR testing site at the end of my street that remains free for my household in a time when that more effective PCR testing is all but gone for most people. And the less effective rapid tests are even them are priced $23 for 2 at the drugstore. This all has been and remains crucial to my well-being and, I believe, my health. But I've taken dozens of surveys about coping during COVID and on living with long COVID. Not one has asked me about the state of my relationships or allowed me to choose sex as one of the activities sustaining my spirit. I'll end with a flat-out request. Continue, resume, or adopt the practice of masking indoors outside your home and in crowded outdoor settings. When you wear KN95 or N95 mask indoors, you aren't just protecting me from further disability from long COVID. You're protecting the workers in stores that will fire them if they take a sick day, or even just for wearing masks. You're protecting the grandparents of the kids on the train with you at a time when older people, Biden's generation, many of whom are vaccinated, make up 90% of COVID deaths. And you're protecting people living with HIV, with diabetes, trans people, bi people, and Black and brown and low-income people who are all more likely to get long COVID and least likely to get help for it. If you believe in health equity, if you give someone a sterile syringe, if you carry Narcan, if you use or support PrEP, if you say the future is trans, if you did or would storm the CDC, FDA, and NIH for overlooking and writing off queers and women and Black and brown Indigenous people and drug users living with HIV, political and moral consistency is wearing a mask indoors in public and crowded outdoor settings. Even if others aren't, even if you're the only one, even if retail workers aren't allowed to. Tell any organization that supports you in any way they should be providing masks and press their funders to. Find the local mask block. It's like syringe distribution, but it's masks. And buy and distribute your own if you can. Thank you.
Thank you, JD, for your wisdom and your political wherewithal. So I'm going to make a little jump, and I think it's an important one. Starting with your thinking about elders, naming yourself as an elder. I look at this group of faces. I don't know exactly how old everyone is, but we are closer to elders than childers. And I was a child when this started. So, that's what happens if you live. And ageism is so prevalent, particularly in regard to long COVID justice and COVID, and how old people are expendable and sick people are expendable. So I wanted to spend some time with some young people that were published in my corpus, which is about women, gay men, and AIDS, and how but I also want to think about how human beings are themselves archives. And part of why we do intergenerational work is because I was 20 in the AIDS crisis, and 30 and 40 and 50. I'm about to turn 60. And my body holds things materially in a different way from books. And I think the other really important thing about intergenerational work, which I do with Ted in our book, and which we do in What Would HIV Doula Do, is that it isn't one directional. It isn't that the elders know more and everyone else should, bow down to our feet and listen. We are constantly in need of knowing what young people know. And that's what I want to share from, I'm going to share 2 short selections where young people in our communities were held up, and we learn from them in these beautiful pages. And so I think the other thing I want to shout out is that the professional, glossy, beautiful squares published famous artists, and they published young people who we needed to hear from and we were inspired by, and we all got the same professional treatment. And that's rare. And it was and is very beautiful. So I'm going to read from a piece from mine. So we're going to hear the voices of some young people. So this is the artist's statement by Tiffany Bears, who was in the empowerment group that Pato and Ray ran for many years at APLA, and I was lucky enough to engage with. And I'm going to just read selectively from her writing, and then also show you how her photographs and her art was really honored in this publication. I'm just going to read a little bit. Boys have been a part of my life. They were my homeboys through elementary school. I would hang out with guys on the playground. I would run around scraping my knees and having the same kind of nosebleeds. I was one of the boys. So now I'm 20 in college, and I'm the same tomboy I've always been. In the gay world, I would label myself a stud. I still hang out with guys, but this time there's a twist. These guys would rather talk about fashion and boys. They are my gay homeboys. They have shown me that it's okay to be who you are, no matter how many people in the world fear and hate us. They have shown me that we should not closet ourselves. We are who we are, whether it is being a stud dyke, butch diva queer, or fairy. And then what happens in this piece is that we see photographs that she's been making as part of the work that they were doing at Empowerment. And she writes these beautiful captions. And so I'm going to read a couple of those captions and let you look at her photographs, which are so, again, held so beautifully on these pages. This is one of the pictures I took on a walk with my friend Albert on the Elysian Park Trail, where the cruising goes on for all the guys. I was there to see what's up, how guys have sex in public. I wish there was a place like that for lesbians. I'd hoped I'd meet a lesbian there. If I was there, I figured there had to be another girl there, one who knows gay guys like me. Gross. That's my first reaction. A used condom. But then I felt, man, that's really cool. Men were doing it right there where I was standing. It's an upside down triangle. It represents gay pride. There's a whole bunch of gay pride going on in that park. A lot of gay sex. We didn't see any, but we saw people sitting down and waiting. I guess someone makes eye contact with someone else, and then they do it. We had never gone up there before, but that place looked so beautiful. A gay triangle at the top of all of LA. It makes you wonder if anyone else in the world knows about this. All those straight people, do they know about this triangle that marks where all this incredible shit goes on? And then there's, I'm not going to read these, but you can see pictures. And there's our author among her pals. And then I'm going to end with, again, a very short reading from this contribution, which was written by my very dear friend and longtime AIDS collaborator, someone I began doing HIV work with in the 1990s, Juanita Mohammed, whose name became Juanita Mohammed Sapansky, who died last year, not of COVID, but inside of and deeply impacted by COVID after having several infections and then being locked into various city-run nursing homes, I suppose you'd call them. And Shaw, who's her son in this, is her son, who I saw most recently at her funeral, is a young man at this time, is now, this is 20 years ago, so he is in his 30s. And I want to honor their conversation and read a tiny bit to you about what she said to them, with him. To the question, what is sex? We both agreed that it is a physical, emotional, biological, mental connection between two people. This is Juanita. He felt it was complicated. In a way, I was surprised he did not answer as the horny teenager I see him as. It is too easy for me to stereotype him because he is my child. I have forgotten what his penis looked like when he was a child, and he has never seen my vagina. We are secrets to each other. It was easier for both of us to answer that safer sex was a way of protecting oneself and partner from getting disease. We agreed that you have to care about your safety if you're going to care about anyone else's. Even though defining safer sex, it is a more important question than what is sex. We are both quick to point out the facts and go into no further detail. If we went into the ins and outs, we would have had to name the sexual parts and the steps that go into using protection, and we were too inhibited about that. And then Shaw answers. I feel that we talk about sex, HIV, and AIDS too much because she has been constantly bringing it up since I was a little kid. I do not feel that there is much more to say. It has all been said before. She, on the other hand, feels that she has to talk about it over and over. I am not a child. I heard her the first 100 times. There has always been a table with condoms in my house. How can I get away from it? She feels like just because I have not seen the way people with AIDS used to look, that I do not think it's real. She thinks that TV and the news make me think the epidemic is over, that my friends and I think the new pills will keep us well. We are not stupid. So that's me. That's me and my beloveds. All of us older, some of us no longer alive.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for bringing Juanita into the room.
My pleasure, always.
Yeah, really beautiful.
So at this point, we've heard a lot of presentations, and I think we get what Corpus does and what it did and how it still inspires and how we can still learn from the way it holds so many diverse voices with so much knowledge and beauty. And I wonder if maybe I could ask like one question to all of you, and then Pato, you can let me know if it would be time to open up the floor.
Sure. Can I do one process point?
Do whatever you'd like.
At the risk of distracting, as we've heard from JD and Alex, I'm channeling my old outreach worker / distribution self. So links finally for all the different publications you've heard about. Alex's book with TED, much of the long COVID justice work that JD shepherds, Jaime's Gordo, the What Would an HIV Doula Do free downloads link, all of that should now be in your chat. So I want to really encourage you, if you're hungry to learn more about how these questions and issues are living very much right now in the present, that's all in the chat. Sorry to step on your question.
No problem. So I'm going to ask one question to all of you. You don't have to answer, but you could. I have said that you are an archive, each and every one of you, an archive with so much value to our communities, to the people in this room right now. And if I was going to be a proper steward of your archive, what would I hold on to and care for and pass on?
Can jump into your very thoughtful question. I think that you know, I'm a multidisciplinary artist, and I've worked in the visual arts and writing and done a bit of photo, mixed media, sculpture. So I have a you know, this practice that has many forms. And I think if I was to imagine an archive, I think the work would be to kind of identify the connective themes that run through them, that thread through all these disparate activities, and to understand the works, as disparate as they are, as being of a piece with each other, connected by these themes that I keep kind of coming back to and that are important to me. Some of these themes are very clear to me. Others, I think I need to have other people point them out to me sometimes, because I don't always see my own patterns and my own repetitions. But yeah, that kind of jumps out to me, is to just to look at the archive of the work, and to imagine what are the through lines here. What's the connective tissue that binds all of this together? That's something that comes to mind immediately.
And of course, in this context, Jaime, AIDS would be the most obvious through line, but only one. And the thing that's so interesting, I think, about this idea of like being archives of this pandemic, and then archives of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and other illnesses as well, I understand in this room.
Yeah, absolutely.
AIDS has changed, you know, like what you held or what you needed at 20 is not what you need at 40, not just because you've changed, but because AIDS has changed and the world has changed. But it's a through line.
Yes, yeah, that I think that's really a very true one. And I think, you know, some of the things that have already kind of been surfaced in this dialogue about the persistence and the holiness of our lust throughout it all.
I felt George was so wonderful in that regard. George, would you, if you're willing to answer the question, we'd love to hear from you. If you're an archive, what should we save and hold and pass on?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the question, Alex. Thank you so much. I heard you speak about this in early calls when we were just talking about the idea of a book. And you talked about the importance of radicality and how radicality jumped off the pages across each of these issues, and why radicality is important, right? It's what it teaches us about what the potential of it, and what it could teach us about what we should be thinking about, how we should be navigating current, challenges that we're faced with. And you're right, HIV's changed quite a bit. One of the things that hasn't changed is that HIV continues to reveal structural inequities, right? And that's another thing that I would hope that, the archive could help with, right? Is to communicate that it's less about the disease, it's more about what the disease reveals to us about how faulty our society is and how wrong our priorities are.
Really appreciate that. And I think Carlos was really thinking about this idea of what it means to try and do radical work inside of institutions that won't fund you, won't listen to you, won't share what you do and support you if you name that. And yet for so many of us, just precisely, these are your words, George, actually, I wrote them down, the insurgent, rebellious, and dissenting nature of each other that brings us to each other, that we need from each other, and that nurtures us in a society that would otherwise want to pretend that isn't possible. And that's captured in Corpus for sure, and hard to do in some of the places that we work otherwise. And that's why we're artists, and that's why we turn to art, because art can always do that for us. It must. And there's so much beautiful art in these pages. Anybody else want to answer before I open the floor up? Yes, Carlos.
I actually wanted to turn this back to you, Alex, because I think you've made a career out of, if I may say that at the risk of overstating the case, your work, so much of your work is precisely about being modeling for us the kind of stewardship of archives. I'm thinking of Video Remains. I'm thinking of, this is the first time we are interacting, but I'm a longstanding fan of your work. I have taught your work, and what I find so incredibly inspiring about it is precisely the humility and the openness and the vulnerability with which you hold space for cross-generational dialogue in Video Remains in particular, but I'm thinking of other films as well. So I think that there's a kind of I'm just turning it back on you to sort of your work that does that work and does that, performs that labor in a way that is about extending those conversations, holding up those bodies for what they remember, and the kinds of communications that we are able to enact cross-generationally, particularly in times when the powers that be are not really that interested. The dialogues need to happen in code oftentimes. And so I just wanted to put it there simply to share that reflection, because so much of what I think what informs what I bring to the panel, to the idea of the panel, has to do with what I've learned from your work and your own sort of archival praxis.
That's incredibly kind and a little surprising. I'm going to turn it to JD, because I think that JD was talking about care, and it began his comments with the ways in which that's so gendered female, it's raced, it's classed, it's always not understood as as the work that's the most important. And I think I would say, care work inside of our communities, inside our radical, lusty communities, that feed me, is the queer feminist work that I most want to do and get the most from, and always want to center as, our best practices. So I don't know if JD wanted to say anything more about caring, for each other, especially when everyone else who's implicated turns away.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I said a lot a couple of minutes ago, but there was even more that I took out. And one of the things I was thinking about and that I saw reflected in Corpus is the care that we gave or got as young people who are dying or around people who are dying. And when care is saying, you know, girl, you better make sure they play that at my funeral and don't put me on that, you know, I look terrible in that color, you know? I mean, and the care of caring for each other, whether we were going to live or not, has transformed me forever. And the unrecognized care work that, or I shouldn't say the unrecognized care, not care work, it doesn't always have to be considered work, the care that is Corpus feels like care. When I held it in my hands, when I opened that box, like it just feels like care in a very tangible way of the care it took to produce and bring it together and to bring it out into the world. To me, that feels like care too. And the caring that was centered in the HIV movements that I came through that was really unrecognized. You know, one of my, you know, comrades and mentors was Kiyoshi Karamiya, lifelong activist who was a big part of ACT UP Philadelphia. And he taught me that, you know, care, it's just, you do it incessantly wherever you are. You go to the hospital and someone needs sheets and you go and you get the sheets because the hospital's too busy, and you don't, you know, you do what needs to be done, you know, and we do it for each other, and you do it. And then when you go out and you bring a young activist to an NIH meeting, you say, oh, Tony Fauci, this is JD, right? Like you just, that's all the care, like caring and connecting and all of it that we did and do. And it's very, very tricky now. It's very difficult to care for one another in an airborne pandemic. Although, you know, for people, it's really bifurcated now where, you know, for a number of years, at least for the first year or so, to some degree, there was more commonalities, and now it's once again what it always is, which is there's people of privilege and people who not. So in my household, we have lots of access to tests and Paxlovid and a million HEPA filters. And so when my child got asymptomatic COVID 2 weeks ago, first of all, we found out about it because we have access to tests that hardly anyone has, and then none of us got it subsequently. So how do we care when caring could endanger caregivers and no one's being given the information or supplies they need? Those are some of the things that are on my mind right now. So I don't know if I answered your question, but care persists. Like care is relentless. Care will happen. Whether it'll be recognized or not is a whole other matter.
Well, I'd like to, I see you, Jaime. I wanted to turn it over to Pato though, but maybe the both of you. When I made my edition, Pato did the design. And, you know, I don't know about who else was doing work like that there. I work closely with Pato, and they partly look this beautiful because, or mine does, because he is an incredible designer as well as an artist and a writer. And so I was wondering if you wanted to talk about care in the production of these pieces, Pato, these and how George and others that supported you. And Jaime, if you want to intervene right now, please do. But that was the last question, and then I can open it up. Yeah.
I definitely want to hear Pato responding to that, but I would just one thought around this question of care and just how contradictory kind of our kind of culture and our country's relationship to it is, because on the one hand there can be like this very sentimental, teary, romanticized kind of approach to care, like, you know, for instance, the care of a mother for her baby. Like there's all this kind of mythology around it, there's this romanticization, there's this soft focus photography around it, you know, all of that, it envelops it. And yet we have like these really stingy family leave policies, right, nationally, around the time it takes to really care for a newborn. And the two are happening at the same time, this romantic valorization of that care, and then the stingy unwillingness to really support it so that it's done well and humanely. So I just want to note that like those two things happen on parallel tracks.
That's why I loved Juanita's conversation with Shah, because, you know, it was the opposite of like romantic mommydom. You know, he's just pushing back, like, you shut up and stop taking care of me by teaching me how to keep myself safe. So many kids are like that. So I love that was in the pages. Pato.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to try to do a little weave stitch. I think there's so much care in our question about the archive, Alex, which I dropped into the chat and framed as a collective question, but what would we hold on to, care for, and share? And I think care runs through it. You talked about that earlier, Jaime, and George, you talked about your love of books, your care for books, and I think one of the class-based ethoses, you hinted at this, Alex, that Tiffany and Mario Sixto, who I showed, and Tyra Crook, who George showed, those were all members of the youth group peer-to-peer education that Ray and others were shepherding, and all of them were sitting next to a Samuel Delaney or a Sarah Schulman or an Alex Juhasz or a Jaime Cortez, and that's by design as a kind of class and intergenerational politic. And the shorthand I would often use when talking in all kinds of spaces, community spaces, bars, universities, if I was invited, would be to say, you know, what would it mean to center our HIV practices in our lives and bodies, as Jaime and George have spoken so eloquently, and JD, and what does it mean to keep our nose in a book, but also on the block, which is just a way of holding different kinds of spaces and modes of being. And I think there was the politic of Corpus had a care. And in terms of the design, I think the writing, you as editors did such extraordinary work that it felt to me like, as the designer, and also along with George as a kind of meta series editor, that the work of the design was to be in service and let the images and the text speak. And so it was neither, it definitely did not, it wanted to repurpose what public health and community health could look and feel like. And so it definitely did not want to feel like a government publication, nor a slick pharma ad, because we were seeing plenty of both, but rather to look and feel like something else, part zine, part art book, part poetry chapbook, and not exactly like any of that. And to hold a sweet spot where, though it was smallish, you know, it was 8 3/8 to be a little bit nerdy, by 8 3/8, and that size is not quite small enough to fit in a pocket, and we had that debate early on, but not quite big enough that you couldn't just tuck it under your arm or put a stack in the corner of the sex club, or put it into a box lovingly and send it to you in Brooklyn, JD. And so thinking about its size as something that could have both a presence but also a mobility and a legibility across many, many different kinds of contexts was part of what the design was trying to do. And to have a typeface that would help with legibility, but neither be too clean and corporate, i.e. look like a product, nor unconsidered as to be super random. And, you know, Jaime and Georgia can testify to how many complaints they would field from me, because I was like, well, I just got this artist's portfolio and they haven't done any of the digital cleaning, and I would have to scrub that shit in Photoshop and take off all the dust marks and adjust the color contrast and try to get it to where I thought the artist's intention was to really honor the work. And that's a kind of digital care for the imagery, or the care that Omar would take in copy editing, or the care that George would take in reviewing everything and shepherding it for the executive director to look at. The range of people who cared for packaging it and getting out into the mail, like all those layers of care show up in something. And it's like the difference between fast food, which I still eat sometimes, but a homemade meal, and all that love and care that could be quite simple or quite elaborate, but would be nourishing either way. And so I think in terms of a design ethos and aesthetic, that's really what it was trying to do on that tip. We have a Q&A function. Oh, sorry, Alex, go ahead.
That meant I'm handing it over to you.
Okay. We have a Q&A function, and I can't tell our beloved audience who's still with us after all this time if there's something that might be on your mind and if that Q&A function is working. But please do drop any questions or comments into the Q&A. And I think most of you are versed in this. I was saying COVID-wise averse, but versed in it. It's the Q&A at the bottom center of your screen, and it looks like part of our turnover comic collection because it's got 2 speech balloons. So if you want to click on that and drop a question, I have one for the group while we wait for our folks in community with us. And I wonder if we could, it's not simply about recentering HIV, though I never want to lose the importance of maintaining and sustaining rigorous, vibrant, playful, caring conversations about HIV in the now. But I also want to hold it in relationship to a lot of what you shared, JD, and I think that others have alluded to. So my question for the group is, how have COVID and monkeypox impacted your sense of HIV? So often in the public press, when we think syndemically, it's the other way around. Well, what can we learn from HIV, which is important for sure. but those framings often posit HIV in the past, and as you reminded us, several of you, as these new things as somehow an anomaly, rather than thinking of them in a dialectic over time. And so again, I'm curious, especially you, George, because you live and breathe this every day, as do you, JD, but what are any of you, how is your thinking about HIV shifting given these other pandemics that we are also living through? And then I'll come to your question, Ray. Okay, George, I'm calling on you.
It's a good question. You know, I realized, you know, I find myself in a public health department, and I'm here because I want to make local impact, and it's a space where I can do that within limits. Yeah. And when monkeypox happened, it was a huge realization that you know, the health department lacked meaningful relationships with Black and Brown LGBTQ organizations at the local level. It just did. If you don't include the service providers in the HIV space, and those they don't see themselves as, you know, LGBT necessarily and LGBTQ necessarily. And the one LGBTQ organization that kind of started a, you know, kind of grassroots clinic, it was the LGBTQ Oakland Community Center. They are not even well funded. They kind of scrape by, and the health department, outside of a couple of very kind of small prevention programs or prevention contracts, the health department has not funded them. And so monkeypox, as an example, has kind of, you know, made me think differently about the way the health department needs to manage its HIV response. In Alameda County, we are so behind in where we should be in the HIV response. It's not funny. Everyone talks about really, you know, viral suppression, and we really need to strive for, you know, 95% of people living with HIV virally suppressed and 100% easy access to PrEP. JD, you know, referenced this in his comments. People of color don't have that kind of access still in Alameda County. Viral suppression is hovering at around 70% in Alameda County, believe it or not. And, you know, access to PrEP is still a struggle, and partly because many people of color, working class people, don't have access to healthcare insurance. And also partly because health providers hold stereotyped ideas about people of color, working class people, as hypersexual, and then therefore undeserving of PrEP. And so even when, you know, our communities show up to ask, they get turned away, right? And so, you know, and I know that monkeypox and COVID, there have been kind of these, you know, moments in which, you know, I'm figuring out, oh shit, we didn't, this health department, you know, is so far away from where it needs to be in its HIV response. And so that's one way that it's helping. In other ways, I just feel like it's a reminder that we're so behind in the way that we think about these things. You know, I'm going to come back to monkeypox response at the local level. Getting people in the health department to understand that we needed to take an intersectional approach, because folks who were disproportionately impacted by monkeypox were Black and Brown, gay, bi, trans men, right? And so their response to me was, oh, we're going to all of the organizations that serve Black and Brown communities. And I'm like, well, how do you know that they're serving, you know, gay, bi, trans community sensitively. No, we're going to them. That's our culturally sensitive response. And, you know, it's hard for me, you know, at one point I got so frustrated. I had a whole group, virtual group in a meeting, about 30 people, 35 people, and I asked people to stop and to say the word gay. That's how bad it was, right? They got there, you know, eventually they got there, right? It empowered, you know, folks who have been with the health department, queer people of color, who felt for a long time sidelined. Even within the HIV response, they felt sidelined. But through their work in monkeypox, through their work in COVID, something is waking them up, right? Like in the health department. And I think that's been really helpful.
I really appreciate that, George. You're making me think of literally today in class, one of my students had a I am gay t-shirt on, and I loved her for it. She was so fabulous. Black lesbian. Question from TR. Did I hear earlier that there will be a publication / media coming out around Corpus? So much good to explore and live with. Thank you for sharing. Thank you, TR. And the simple answer is yes. I think we're a little bit embargoed about going into too much detail, but in 2024, we anticipate a collection that revisits Corpus. And in some ways, this conversation we're having tonight is a way to workshop some of the ideas that might appear in that book. So I'm just going to say stay tuned. George, can we say any more? Or do we have to leave it there?
I mean, we have to leave it there.
Okay, no problem. Second, the great Ted Kerr says, love for the content and look of Corpus. It brought me / brings me strength, programming ideas, and friends. Love, Ted. And right back at you, Ted. The book that you've done with Alex and all the work that you've shepherded with the doulas. And I always joke, because of AIDS gallow humor, Jaime, which you alluded to in your intro at the top of the night, that this is AIDS season, right? It's the one time a year when we're all called to do programs. And, you know, for those of us who do it every day, it's like, okay, but I've lost track, Ted, at how many programs you've led that have just been transformative over the last week. So thank you for your work.
And can I say also that Ted and Alex, I'm a big fan of your work. Your essay around what it meant to co-author a book together really was so helpful. Pato introduced me to that essay. I just love it, and I adore the two of you for writing that. It's very vulnerable and important work.
Yeah, and I want to say that in these spaces, particularly with the university frame, we're somehow expected not to bring our emotions to the work or our relations, when in fact what makes this kind of radical work possible is that we care for each other, like your question, Alex, and that it's not just nepotism, right? Hopefully, because we're reflexive and we're rigorous and we're critical, and we're always asking who's not fucking present. And what do we need to do to make sure that we have as many of us present as possible, not just in halls of power, but in the work itself, right? And so when I think about this moving of URLs and each other's work, it's in that spirit. We weave community through our work together, which I find very moving. Rona Kapadia does this all the time in Chicago and beyond, and also has a shout out for the room. Just wanted to say big love to all the legends on this panel for your brilliant, principled, rageful, precise world making, creativity, and wisdom. That's Ronak's amazing articulateness. I still treasure my OG early 2000s hard copies of Corpus, Sexilio, and beyond. Ronak, when you're ready for early retirement, rumor has it that the gray and many shades of gray market will fetch a fine price if you ever want to sell. But I think George and I may be sitting on some hard copy archives in a special garage somewhere to be unnamed that we can distribute. Samantha, first, will we have access to the recording? I think that's a yes from Rutgers. And I want to take this moment to just thank Carlos Ulises Decena, the incredible Dolores Turchi, Tanya Bentley, all from Rutgers Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice, at a moment when state governments and the federal government is lining up to be against this kind of work, just like they took Corpus off tables 20 years ago, and just like they're taking this kind of work off curricula at all kinds of levels now. The Institute's work is so vital. So I want to shout all of you out under Carlos's leadership, and just thank Dolores and Tanya for all that you did to navigate tech poltergeists, etc. Samantha, will we have access to the recording? I'm pretty sure Rutgers will send that out to those of us who signed up and are here. And it's so great of you to pass that on to your MSW class. And you're welcome for the panel. It's really great to have you with us. Carol, one of my students, now you're going to make me get all my feels on. Just here to express my gratitude for all of your knowledge and for sharing with all of us today. As a young queer person, I feel so grateful to learn from you and feel inspired. And it's right back at you, Carol. It's mutual, and I can't wait to see you in class tomorrow. Ray, who many of you have heard me shout out a few times, just wanted to say thank you to all of you, tell you how much I love you and the work we did, the time and space we made and shared. You brought back so many wonderful and much needed memories, and the important reminder to preserve all of that and enact it and make it present. Ronak says, never. The collection is going with us to the queer heaven above. And our fabulous compa for George and Carlos and all of us on the call, but who's been so important to many of us. Brilliant conversation, gracias. I always felt that Corpus anticipated the popular education work that anti-fascist forces in the US are doing now. Alex, do you want to sit up just a little more so we can see some of that work on your shirt? Not in our name, thoughts. That is a big one, Edgar. I feel like we're going to need to get together in 2 weeks in LA over some yummy comida and pull Ray in and have that conversation. But I would say humbly, yes, simply because Corpus in turn was drawing from Kitchen Table Press, Joseph Beam and Essex Hemphill, as others recalled, that all that's going back to anti-lynching campaigns, first and second wave feminism, literally at this point, centuries of indigenous survivance in the Western Hemisphere against colonialism ongoing. And so to the extent that Corpus tried to be connected to and drawing from those traditions, it in turn becomes just one small creek in a bunch of tributaries that lead to a raging river of change. So I'd like to think that's possible. And to Alex and Carlos's charges to shepherd the archive with care and in perpetuity, or at least as long as it's relevant, that's our work, is to do something like this and connect it across generations so that it contribute to this amazing groundswell that I think is building on 2020, which was building on Occupy, which is building on the untenableness of the conditions in which we're living, but these incredible other ways of being and world making that we've been doing all along and that we're going to keep doing. So Carlos, we're, I think, at time, but I want to pass to you to see if you have any last word. I want to thank you again for bringing us together tonight and all the work you do at the Institute.
Thank you, Pato. I did want to say that there is a hand raised among the attendees, and I was hoping that if this person wanted to speak, oh, Raymond,
That was Ray, and I texted Ray to get the quote in, and then I read it, but
oh, got it. Okay.
Isn't to say I don't want to hear Ray's lovely voice, but I think the tech may be against us and conspiring.
Yes, I want to say how important the presence of everyone here has been to my own growth and development in this field, not because I'm pretty contemporary to several of you here, but I think that as someone who arrived in New York City to pursue graduate studies, I tried to find a way of being queer at the time through this world of HIV/AIDS work, which connected me with the rage, with the sadness and the fierceness of that earlier generation of queer folk who mobilized. And I think that what was pretty extraordinary to me about these artifacts that I began to mobilize, not just in my teaching, but in my daily life, and was that their capacity to conjure those pasts that we hold in common. There is an element of and it was JD who talked perhaps about the Bible, that the thumping of the Bible on the table. And I was thinking about the power of conjure of these documents as ways to bring in the ancestors, the kind of ancestors that we want to hold near us, our dearly departed, yet here. And then also the way in which we are becoming ancestors as we age, as we transmit knowledge, as we pass things along to the ones coming behind. And so one of the things that I find really clarifying about this panel is just our collective ability to sort of build place out of that sense of vulnerability and openness, which not only enlarges or exercises that soul work that many of us pursue through our work, but that also helps make the world a little bit more expansive and more open, perhaps, than the one that we are inheriting ourselves. So thank you, everybody, for for chiming in, and I want to thank Pato Hebert in particular for being such a partner in crime, and such an open soul, and such a fiercely visionary compa. Good night, everybody.